My name is Delilah. I'm 29, and I'm the kind of woman my family always saw as the responsible backup plan. The one who fixes problems quietly, who never argues back, who says, yes, when everyone else says, take. I was the daughter who drove 3 hours every weekend to help Grandpa Ezra tend his sprawling wheat farm in Millbrook Valley, while my older sister Cassandra posted Instagram stories from wine tastings in the city. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. For as long as I can remember, I was the invisible one. When we were kids, Cassandra got the dance lessons and the designer clothes because she had natural charm. I got hand-me-downs and the expectation that I'd be grateful for whatever was left over. When she crashed Dad's car at 17, I gave up my college fund to help cover the insurance deductible. When she needed someone to co-sign her first apartment lease, guess who drove 6 states over to make it happen? But it wasn't just the money or the favors. It was the pattern. Cassandra would create chaos, disappear when things got complicated, then resurface with a sob story about how life was just so hard for someone trying to find themselves. Meanwhile, I was the one who stayed. I was the one who answered Grandpa's calls when his arthritis flared up. I was the one who learned to operate the ancient tractor when he couldn't manage the clutch anymore. I was the one who spent my vacation days helping him navigate Medicare paperwork and drove him to every single doctor's appointment for the last 4 years of his life. Cassandra would show up twice a year. Christmas morning for photos, and maybe his birthday if it fell on a weekend. She'd breeze in with expensive flowers and stories about her latest business venture, kiss his cheek, and vanish before anyone could ask her to actually help with anything. But somehow, she was still Grandpa's little angel, because she inherited his blue eyes and could make him laugh with her theatrical personality. When Grandpa Ezra passed last spring, I wasn't surprised that he left me everything. The 340-acre wheat farm, the farmhouse that had been in our family for 3 generations, the vintage John Deere equipment, and about $180,000 in savings he'd kept in a local credit union. I'd earned it. Not through manipulation or charm, but through 4 years of genuine care when everyone else was too busy living their own lives. The will reading was awkward. Cassandra sat there with her perfectly manicured nails, tapping them against her designer purse, wearing a black dress that probably cost more than I made in a month at the veterinary clinic where I worked. When the lawyer read my name as the sole beneficiary, her face went through a series of expressions. Surprise, confusion, then that familiar tight smile she'd perfected since childhood, the one that meant she was already planning how to fix this misunderstanding. But she didn't say anything that day. She hugged me, told me she was happy for me, and even offered to help with the transition. I should have known better. I should have remembered that Cassandra never accepted anything that didn't go her way, not without a fight. The farm was my sanctuary. After a lifetime of living in cramped apartments and feeling like I never belonged anywhere, I finally had a place that was truly mine. I spent my weekends there, learning the rhythms of the land, understanding why Grandpa had never wanted to sell despite the developers who'd been circling Millbrook Valley like vultures for the past decade. The property was worth nearly $1 million now, but its value to our family was immeasurable. I wasn't ready to move there full-time yet. I kept my apartment in the city while I figured out how to transition from veterinary work to farming, maybe find a way to do both. The inheritance money was sitting safely in a trust account, earning modest interest while I planned my next steps. I was thinking about upgrading some of the equipment, maybe investing in sustainable farming techniques that would honor Grandpa's legacy while making the operation more profitable. That was my first mistake. I was thinking like the old Delilah, the one who planned carefully and trusted family members to respect boundaries. I wasn't thinking like someone who needed to protect herself from people who saw her success as their opportunity. 3 months after the funeral, I drove out to Millbrook Valley for my regular weekend visit. I had groceries in the back seat and a list of small repairs I wanted to tackle around the farmhouse. The autumn air was crisp, and the wheat fields looked golden in the late afternoon sunlight. I felt that familiar sense of peace as I pulled into the gravel driveway. But when I unlocked the front door and checked the mail that had been forwarding to my apartment, my blood turned to ice. Bank statements showing my inheritance account had been emptied. Transfer records I'd never authorized. And a single note, handwritten in Cassandra's flowing script, left on the kitchen counter like she was announcing dinner plans. Delilah had to make a quick decision to save the farm. The Hendersons were going to foreclose on the property next to Grandpa's land, and you know how he always said we needed to keep the valley in farming families, not let developers take over. I used the inheritance money to buy their place and merge it with ours. It's an investment that'll double our family's holding. You're going to thank me when you see the long-term value. We can talk details when you're ready. See. Our family's holding. Like she'd contributed anything. Like she had any right to make decisions about money that was legally mine. I stood in that kitchen, holding the note, and something fundamental shifted inside me. For 29 years, I'd been the accommodating one, the flexible one, the one who absorbed other people's messes without complaint. But as I stared at those bank statements showing a zero balance where my inheritance should have been, I realized I was done being the family doormat. What Cassandra didn't know was that I'd inherited more than just Grandpa's farm and his money. I'd also inherited his meticulous record-keeping, his understanding of land law, and his deep distrust of anyone who made big promises without showing their work first. And what she definitely didn't know was that the investment she thought she'd made was about to become the biggest mistake of her life. Because there was no Henderson foreclosure. There never had been. And what my dear sister had actually done with my inheritance was something so much worse than stealing. She'd walked straight into a trap that was about to destroy everything she thought she'd gained, and this time, I wasn't going to be there to clean up her mess. This time, I was going to watch it all burn down around her. I didn't call Cassandra immediately. That would have been the old Delilah's move, panicking, demanding explanations, letting emotion drive the conversation. Instead, I sat at Grandpa Ezra's worn kitchen table, the same one where he'd taught me to balance farm ledgers when I was 12, and I started making phone calls. The first call was to Millbrook Valley Credit Union, where Grandpa had banked for 40 years. Janet Pruitt, the branch manager, had known our family since before I was born. Her voice went tight when I explained what I'd discovered. Delilah, honey, I'm so sorry. Your sister came in 6 weeks ago with all the right paperwork. Power of attorney documents, estate authorization forms, the works. Everything looked legitimate. My stomach dropped. Power of attorney? When was that supposedly signed? According to the documents, 3 days before your grandfather passed. She said you were too emotional to handle the financial decisions and that he'd asked her to step in. Janet's voice carried the weight of someone who'd made a terrible mistake. She seemed to know all the account details, even mentioned conversations you'd had with your grandfather about keeping the farm in the family. That's when the first piece clicked into place. Cassandra hadn't just stolen my money on impulse. She'd been planning this for months, probably since the moment she realized Grandpa's will didn't include her name. The power of attorney documents were fake, but sophisticated enough to fool a small-town bank that had trusted our family for decades. Janet, I need you to pull every piece of paperwork she submitted. And I need the surveillance footage from that day. Of course. And Delilah? I'm filing an internal incident report immediately. If those documents were forged. The second call was to my cousin Marcus, who worked for the county recorder's office. If Cassandra had actually purchased the Henderson property like she claimed, there would be a deed transfer on file. Marcus called me back within 20 minutes. Delilah, there's no Henderson property in Millbrook Valley. Never has been. I checked back 30 years just to be sure. And there haven't been any property transfers involving your grandfather's land since 1987. So where had my $180,000 gone? The third call was to my grandfather's lawyer, Harold Westfield, who'd handled our family's legal affairs for 2 decades. Harold's news was even worse than I'd expected. Your sister contacted me 8 weeks ago, claiming she needed to discuss some irregularities in your grandfather's will. She suggested that his mental state near the end might have affected his decision-making, and that the family should consider a more equitable distribution of assets. 8 weeks ago. Before she'd emptied my accounts, Cassandra had already been laying groundwork to contest the will itself. Did you meet with her? I asked, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles went white. I did. She brought what appeared to be medical records suggesting your grandfather had been experiencing cognitive decline. She also implied that you might have exerted undue influence over him in his final months. Harold's voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the discomfort underneath. I told her that any formal challenge would require significant evidence and court proceedings. Harold, those medical records, did you verify them? A pause. I assumed they were legitimate. She said they came from Dr. Morrison's office. Dr. Morrison had been Grandpa's physician for 15 years. I'd been to every appointment with him for the past 4 years, and there had never been any concerns about cognitive decline. In fact, Dr. Morrison had frequently commented on how sharp Grandpa stayed right up until the end. But the most important detail wasn't what Cassandra had done, it was when she'd started planning it. The fake power of attorney dated 3 days before Grandpa's death. The approach to the lawyer 8 weeks ago. The bank visit 6 weeks ago. This wasn't a desperate decision made in the heat of the moment. This was a calculated, months-long campaign to strip me of everything Grandpa had left me. That night, I drove back to my apartment in the city, my mind racing. I'd spent the day uncovering the scope of Cassandra's deception, but I still didn't know the most crucial piece. What had she actually done with my money? The answer came in an email that arrived at 11:47 p.m., sent from an address I didn't recognize, DelilahUpdate2024@gmail.com. She'd created a fake email account just to contact me, which should have been my first red flag about what was coming next. Delilah, I know you're upset, and I understand why. I should have talked to you first, but there wasn't time. The Henderson situation was moving fast, and I had to act quickly to protect what Grandpa built. But I promise you, this is going to work out better than you can imagine. I've been working with a development group called Apex Valley Holdings. They specialize in agricultural preservation projects, taking old family farms and turning them into sustainable agritourism destinations. Think farm-to-table restaurants, wedding venues, educational tours, the whole package. It's a booming industry. They were specifically interested in Grandpa's property because of its location and the historical farmhouse. But the project only works if we can acquire the surrounding land to create a proper buffer zone. That's why I had to move fast on the Henderson property, except it turns out the Hendersons weren't the real opportunity. Apex Valley Holdings has offered to buy both properties, Grandpa's original farm and the Henderson land, for $2.8 million. That's nearly 3 times what the land was worth separately. After we pay back the initial investment and cover development costs, we'll each walk away with over $800,000. I know this seems crazy, but I've seen the contracts. I've met with their team. This is legitimate, and it's our chance to honor Grandpa's memory while setting both of us up financially for life. The closing is scheduled for next month. I should have included you from the beginning, and I'm sorry for that. But when you see the final numbers, you'll understand why I had to act when I did. This kind of opportunity doesn't wait for family meetings. Call me when you're ready to hear the full plan. Cassandra. P.S. I know you think I never cared about the farm, but Grandpa's legacy matters to me too. This isn't about the money. It's about making sure what he built continues to thrive. I read the email 3 times, and with each reading, my anger transformed into something colder and more focused. Because I recognized every word of this con. The time pressure, the massive payout, the appeal to family honor, these were classic fraud tactics, and Cassandra had walked straight into them. But worse than that, she dragged me into it without my consent, using my inheritance as collateral for whatever scheme she'd gotten involved in. And now she was trying to manipulate me into going along with it by framing her theft as a family investment opportunity. That's when I realized that saving my money was only part of the problem I was facing. Cassandra wasn't just a thief, she was a victim of a sophisticated scam, and she'd made me an unwilling participant. Which meant that when this whole thing collapsed, and it absolutely would collapse, she'd find a way to blame me for not supporting her opportunity. Unless I got ahead of it first. I opened my laptop and started researching Apex Valley Holdings. It took me exactly 12 minutes to confirm what I already suspected: the company didn't exist. The website was 3 weeks old, the phone number went to a voicemail box that had never been set up, and the business address was a UPS store in a strip mall 2 states away. My sister hadn't just stolen my inheritance to buy imaginary farmland. She'd handed my money over to professional con artists, and now she was trying to convince me to celebrate the decision. That was the moment I stopped being angry and started being strategic. Because Cassandra was about to learn that the quiet, accommodating sister she'd been taking advantage of for 29 years had finally found her backbone. And this time, I wasn't going to clean up her mess. I was going to let her drown in it. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and started planning. The old Delilah would have called Cassandra immediately, probably crying, demanding she fix this mess. But 4 years of watching Grandpa navigate local politics, land disputes, and equipment dealers had taught me something valuable. When someone shows you who they really are, believe them the first time. And when they try to scam you, document everything before you respond. By 6 a.m., I had a 3-page action plan written out in my careful handwriting, the same methodical approach Grandpa had used when planning crop rotations or budgeting for equipment repairs. The first step was information gathering. I needed to understand exactly how deep this con went before I could figure out how to get my money back and make sure Cassandra never pulled something like this again. I started with Dr. Morrison's office. Sarah, his longtime receptionist, was shocked when I described the medical records Cassandra had supposedly obtained. Delilah, honey, we never released any records to your sister. And there certainly weren't any concerns about your grandfather's mental state. You know how sharp he was at his last appointment in February. Her voice carried genuine confusion. If someone has medical records with our letterhead claiming cognitive decline, they're completely fabricated. That confirmed the first piece of fraud: forged medical documents. I asked Sarah to prepare a written statement confirming that no records had been released and that Grandpa had shown no signs of cognitive impairment. She agreed immediately and offered to have Dr. Morrison review Grandpa's file to provide additional documentation of his mental acuity. Next, I called the county courthouse and requested copies of all documents filed related to any property transfers involving our family's land. The clerk, Mrs. Patterson, had processed the original deed when Grandpa inherited the farm from his father. There haven't been any filings involving your grandfather's property since the original inheritance back in 1987, she confirmed. And there's definitely no Henderson family listed in our property records for Millbrook Valley. If someone claims they purchased Henderson land, they're either confused about the location or they're lying. I asked Mrs. Patterson to prepare a certified statement showing the complete chain of title for Grandpa's property, going back 50 years. I wanted official documentation that no Henderson property existed and that no transfers had been made. She promised to have it ready by the end of the week. The third call was to my contact at the Better Business Bureau. Tommy Valdez had gone to high school with me and now worked as a fraud investigator. When I described Apex Valley Holdings, he whistled low. Agricultural development scams are huge right now, especially targeting people who inherit family land. The con artists know that family farms often sit on valuable property, and they prey on people who are emotionally vulnerable after losing a relative. Tommy's tone was grimly professional. The fact that they targeted your sister so quickly after your grandfather's death isn't a coincidence. They probably monitor obituaries and property records looking for exactly this situation. Tommy agreed to open an official investigation into Apex Valley Holdings and to coordinate with the FBI's Financial Fraud Division if the scam crossed state lines. He also connected me with a forensic accountant who specialized in tracking stolen funds. That afternoon, I drove to Millbrook Valley Credit Union and met with Janet Pruitt and their security officer, a former police detective named Ray Chin. They'd already begun their internal investigation, and what they'd found was deeply troubling. The power of attorney documents your sister presented were sophisticated forgeries, Ray explained, spreading copies across the conference table. The letterhead, the notary seals, even the paper stock was designed to match legitimate estate documents. This wasn't some amateur operation with a home printer. Janet pulled up the security footage from the day Cassandra had made the withdrawal. On the grainy black and white screen, I watched my sister walk into the bank wearing a black dress and carrying a leather portfolio. She looked confident, professional, nothing like someone who was nervously attempting fraud. She knew exactly what to say, Janet admitted. She referenced specific conversations you'd supposedly had with your grandfather about farm preservation, mentioned concerns about property developers, even knew about the old equipment loan he'd paid off last year. Either she'd done extensive research, or she had help, Ray finished. Someone fed her information to make her story believable. That possibility hadn't occurred to me. Who would have had detailed knowledge about Grandpa's finances and my conversations with him? The list was short: family members, Dr. Morrison, Harold Westfield, Janet herself, and maybe a few close neighbors. Ray was already thinking along the same lines. We're going to review all phone records for the accounts involved, see if we can trace any suspicious contact patterns leading up to the withdrawal. I left the credit union with copies of all the forged documents and a promise that they'd cooperate fully with any criminal investigation. But more importantly, I left with a clear understanding that this wasn't just Cassandra making a bad decision. Someone had specifically targeted our family, researched our vulnerabilities, and coached my sister through an elaborate fraud scheme. That evening, I created a separate email account and started documenting everything. I scanned every document, saved every voicemail, and created a detailed timeline of events. I also opened a new bank account at a different institution and moved my remaining personal funds there. If Cassandra had access to forged power of attorney documents, I wasn't taking any chances with my own finances. But the most important step came when I called my own attorney, Rebecca Stone, who specialized in estate law and financial fraud. Rebecca had handled some property disputes for farmers in the valley, and Grandpa had recommended her before he died. "This is a federal crime," Rebecca said after I'd walked her through the situation. "Wire fraud, elder abuse fraud even though the documents were forged after his death, possibly money laundering depending on where the funds ended up. Your sister is looking at serious prison time if we pursue this criminally." That stopped me cold. I wanted my money back, and I wanted Cassandra to face consequences for what she'd done. But prison seemed extreme, especially if she was as much a victim of this con as I was. What if we focus on recovering the funds first and see where the investigation leads? Rebecca suggested. I can file a civil suit to freeze any remaining assets and trace the money trail. If your sister cooperated with the fraudsters knowingly, that'll become clear during discovery. If she was manipulated, we might be able to work out a restitution arrangement. I agreed to start with the civil approach, but I made one thing clear: I wanted every legal protection in place to prevent Cassandra from accessing any of my remaining assets or making any decisions related to the farm. Rebecca promised to have restraining orders filed within 48 hours. The last step of my preparation phase was the hardest. I drove back to the farm and spent the afternoon in Grandpa's office, going through his files methodically. Hidden in an old filing cabinet, I found something that changed everything: a folder labeled "Development Offers" that contained 2 years' worth of correspondence from legitimate companies interested in purchasing farmland in Millbrook Valley. None of them were called Apex Valley Holdings, but the language was eerily similar to what Cassandra had described in her email. Offers to preserve agricultural heritage while creating sustainable development opportunities. References to agritourism and farm-to-table concepts. Even specific mentions of using the historical farmhouse as a centerpiece. Someone had clearly studied these legitimate offers and created a convincing fake version to use in the con. But more disturbing than that, the folder had been disturbed recently. Papers were out of order, and there were coffee ring stains that hadn't been there during Grandpa's lifetime. Cassandra had been in this office. She'd gone through these files, probably looking for information she could use to make her story more convincing. Which meant she knew more about the family's financial situation than she'd let on, and she'd been planning this deception for longer than I'd realized. As I locked up the farmhouse that evening, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't rushing to fix someone else's crisis. I wasn't making excuses for Cassandra's behavior or trying to minimize the damage she'd caused. Instead, I was building a case. A methodical, documented, legally bulletproof case that would not only get my money back but ensure that my sister never put me or anyone else in our family in this position again. Tomorrow, I would finally call Cassandra back. But I wouldn't be calling as the accommodating younger sister she expected. I'd be calling as someone who had all the facts, all the documentation, and all the legal protection I needed to destroy whatever game she thought she was playing. For 29 years, I'd been cleaning up after her mistakes. This time, she was going to clean up after herself. The call came at 7:23 a.m. on Thursday morning, 3 days after I'd discovered the theft. I was drinking coffee at my kitchen table, reviewing the legal documents Rebecca had prepared, when Cassandra's name flashed across my phone screen. I let it ring 4 times before answering, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Hello, Cassandra." "Delilah." "Finally. I've been worried sick that you were angry about the Henderson situation." Her voice carried that familiar breathless energy, the tone she used when she was trying to steamroll past uncomfortable topics. "Did you get my email? I know it's a lot to process, but once you understand the full scope of what we're dealing with here." "I got it." I kept my response short, letting silence fill the space where she expected enthusiasm. "Great. So you can see why I had to move quickly. The Apex Valley Holdings team is flying in next Tuesday for the final walkthrough before closing. I've arranged for us to meet them at the farm around 10 a.m. You're going to love these people, Delilah. They really understand what Grandpa was trying to build, and they have such incredible vision for." "Tell me about the Henderson family," I interrupted. A pause. Just half a second, but enough to confirm what I already suspected. "What do you mean? You said you bought their property to prevent foreclosure." "I'm curious about them. How long had they been farming in Millbrook Valley? What crops did they grow? Who were we saving the land from?" "Well, it's complicated. The family had some financial difficulties, and there were developers circling, you know how it is. Sometimes these situations move so fast that you don't get all the personal details." Cassandra's voice had shifted slightly, less confident. "The important thing is that we prevented the land from being turned into strip malls or housing developments." "Where exactly was their property located?" "Adjacent to Grandpa's eastern border. About 40 acres of prime wheat land." The answer came too quickly, too rehearsed. I made a note on my legal pad. Cassandra had clearly prepared for basic questions about the Henderson property, but she didn't actually know the geography of Millbrook Valley well enough to realize that Grandpa's eastern border was the Miller Creek, which had been undeveloped wetland for over a century. "And you said the closing is next month?" "Tuesday the 15th. That's why the Apex people are flying in next week for the final inspection. They want to walk the entire property, both parcels, and finalize the development timeline." Cassandra's enthusiasm was building again, fed by what she probably thought was my growing interest. "Delilah, I know this seems overwhelming, but you have to trust me on this. When we walk away with over $800,000 each, you're going to realize this was the best thing that ever happened to our family." "Who's handling the legal work for the sale?" "Apex has their own legal team. They specialize in agricultural transitions, so they know all the local regulations and zoning requirements. Everything's being handled professionally." Another red flag. No legitimate property transaction of this size would proceed without independent legal representation for the sellers. But I kept my voice neutral, letting Cassandra dig herself deeper. "I'd like to meet with your contact at Apex before Tuesday. Get some more details about their development plans." "Of course. Actually, that's perfect timing. Brianna Hartwell, she's their acquisition director, is supposed to call me this afternoon to confirm Tuesday's schedule. I can have her reach out to you directly." I wrote down the name, though I was certain it would turn out to be as fictional as everything else about this scheme. "What's her number?" "I'd prefer to call her myself." "Oh, she's traveling this week, doing site visits for other projects. But I'll make sure she has your contact information." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Cassandra painting increasingly elaborate pictures of our shared future as wealthy landowners. She described meeting rooms in downtown hotels, architectural renderings of the proposed development, even specific conversations with local officials about zoning approvals. The level of detail was impressive, but it all had the hollow ring of someone reciting a script they'd been given. What bothered me most wasn't the obvious lies. It was how convinced Cassandra seemed by her own story. Either she was a much better actress than I'd given her credit for, or the people running this con had done an excellent job of making her believe she was part of a legitimate business opportunity rather than a victim being used to steal from her own family. When we finally hung up, I immediately called Rebecca Stone. "She's definitely being coached," Rebecca agreed after I'd recounted the conversation. "The way she deflected your questions about the Henderson family, the vague details about the development company, the insistence that their legal team handle everything, these are classic signs of someone who's been fed a story without understanding the underlying facts." "So you think she really believes this is legitimate?" "It's possible. Sophisticated con artists often convince their initial victims that they're partners rather than marks. It makes them more effective at recruiting additional victims, like family members." Rebecca's tone was grim. "But that doesn't change the fact that she stole your money to participate in this scheme." That afternoon, I received a call from Tommy Valdez at the Better Business Bureau. His research on Apex Valley Holdings had turned up disturbing connections. The website domain was registered 6 months ago using a fake address in Delaware, he reported. The phone number traces to a VoIP service that bounces calls through multiple states. But here's the interesting part: we've identified at least 3 other families in different states who've been approached by companies with similar names and identical business models. What happened to them? 2 families lost their entire inheritance, about $300,000 combined. The third got suspicious early and reported it before transferring any money. Tommy paused. In each case, the initial contact was made through a family member who'd been recruited as what they thought was a business partner. The pattern was clear. These weren't random targeting of inheritance recipients. The scammers were identifying vulnerable families, recruiting an inside person with promises of shared profits, then using that person's family connections and knowledge to steal from other relatives. "Do you think my sister was specifically recruited, or did she find them somehow?" "Based on what you've told me, I'd guess recruitment. Someone probably approached her months ago, maybe even before your grandfather died, and started building the relationship gradually." Tommy's voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen this pattern too many times. "They would have researched your family thoroughly, identified her as the most likely person to take financial risks, and then fed her information designed to make her feel like an insider." That evening, I received the call I'd been expecting. The phone number wasn't one I recognized, but the voice was professional, confident, with just a hint of a southern accent. "Miss Delilah? This is Brianna Hartwell from Apex Valley Holdings. Your sister Cassandra asked me to reach out regarding our upcoming site visit. I'd prepared for this conversation carefully." "Hello, Brianna. I appreciate you taking the time to call. I have some questions about the development timeline." "Of course. I'm so excited about this project. Your grandfather's property has such incredible potential, and combining it with the Henderson parcel creates opportunities we rarely see in agricultural preservation." For the next 20 minutes, Brianna painted the same elaborate picture Cassandra had described. Farm-to-table restaurants, educational tours, wedding venues, all designed to honor agricultural heritage while generating substantial profits. She knew details about Millbrook Valley that would have required research, referenced local zoning laws accurately, and even mentioned specific historical features of Grandpa's farmhouse. But when I asked about viewing the development contracts before Tuesday's meeting, her tone shifted slightly. "I understand your desire to review everything thoroughly, but our legal team prefers to handle all document review during the formal closing process. It's a liability issue. We've had problems in the past with preliminary contracts being shared inappropriately." "What about references from your previous projects?" "I'd love to speak with other families who've worked with Apex." A pause. "Most of our clients prefer to maintain privacy about their financial transactions. I'm sure you understand." By the time we hung up, I had no doubt that Brianna Hartwell was part of the con. She was smooth, professional, and convincing, but she'd avoided every question that would have required providing verifiable information. More importantly, she'd confirmed that Tuesday's meeting was designed to be the final step in the scam. Whatever signature they planned to get from me at that meeting would probably complete the theft of Grandpa's property, not just the inheritance money. That night, I finalized my own plans. Rebecca had all the legal protections in place. Tommy had alerted the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. The bank had flagged all accounts connected to our family for suspicious activity. And I had documented every conversation, every lie, every inconsistency in Cassandra's story. On Tuesday morning, I would indeed meet with the Apex Valley Holdings team. But I wouldn't be coming as the naive younger sister they expected. I'd be coming with a recorder, a lawyer, and enough evidence to turn their attempted real estate scam into a federal criminal case. Cassandra thought she was protecting me from my own emotional reactions by handling this opportunity herself. She was about to discover that my emotional reactions were the least of her problems. Tuesday morning arrived with an unseasonable chill that made the October air bite through my jacket as I drove toward Millbrook Valley. I'd barely slept, running through every possible scenario for what was about to unfold. In the passenger seat sat a leather portfolio containing copies of all the evidence I'd gathered, bank records, forged documents, timeline notes, and a small digital recorder that Rebecca had insisted I bring. I arrived at the farm 30 minutes early, wanting time to prepare. The morning mist was just lifting off the wheat fields, and the old Victorian farmhouse looked peaceful in the golden sunlight. It was hard to believe that in less than an hour, this place would become the center of a confrontation that would determine whether I lost everything Grandpa had worked for. At exactly 9:45 a.m., I saw Cassandra's white BMW pull into the gravel driveway, followed by a sleek black SUV with tinted windows. My stomach tightened as I watched three people emerge from the SUV, two men in expensive suits and a woman with blonde hair wearing a navy blazer. Even from a distance, they looked exactly like what central casting would order for legitimate business executives. Cassandra practically bounced out of her car, wearing a red dress I'd never seen before and carrying a designer handbag that probably cost more than my monthly salary. She waved enthusiastically at the Apex team, then noticed me standing on the porch. "Delilah. Perfect timing. Come meet the people who are going to change our lives." The woman I assumed was Brianna Hartwell approached with a confident smile, extending her hand. "Miss Delilah, such a pleasure to finally meet in person. Cassandra has told us so much about you and your dedication to preserving your grandfather's legacy." Her handshake was firm, her eye contact steady, and her voice carried just the right mix of professionalism and warmth. If I hadn't spent the past week documenting her lies, I might have actually liked her. "Thank you for coming," I replied neutrally. "I'm looking forward to learning more about your development plans." The two men introduced themselves as Jonathan Mills, Apex's project manager, and David Chen, their financial coordinator. Both carried leather portfolios and spoke with the kind of polished confidence that comes from years of practice convincing people to sign documents they don't fully understand. "Shall we start with a tour of the property?" Brianna suggested. "I'd love to show you how we envision integrating the existing structures with our agricultural preservation model." For the next 45 minutes, we walked the grounds while Brianna painted an elaborate picture of the future. She pointed to the old barn and described how it would become a farm-to-table restaurant featuring locally sourced ingredients. She gestured toward the rolling wheat fields and explained how they'd host educational tours for school children and agricultural workshops for adults. She even had specific plans for the farmhouse, which would serve as a boutique bed and breakfast highlighting the region's farming heritage. The level of detail was impressive. She knew which fields were best suited for which crops, understood the seasonal planting patterns, and even referenced specific equipment needs for modern sustainable farming. Someone had done their homework. But what struck me most was how Cassandra hung on every word, nodding enthusiastically and adding her own observations about Grandpa's farming methods and family history. She wasn't just playing along with a script, she genuinely believed everything Brianna was telling us. As we circled back toward the farmhouse, Jonathan Mills pulled out a tablet and showed us architectural renderings of the proposed development. The images were professionally produced, showing the farmhouse surrounded by carefully landscaped gardens, the barn converted into an elegant restaurant space, and walking trails winding through the wheat fields. The total development investment will be approximately $1.8 million over 3 phases, he explained, swiping through additional renderings. Phase 1 focuses on the restaurant and basic infrastructure. Phase 2 adds the bed and breakfast accommodations. Phase 3 implements the educational programming and expands the agricultural operations. David Shin stepped forward with his own portfolio. Which brings us to the financial structure. Your family's total investment, the original property plus the Henderson parcel, represents about 60% of the project's asset base. Our development capital covers the remaining 40% plus all construction and marketing costs. I watched Cassandra's face light up as David walked through projected revenues and profit-sharing arrangements. According to his carefully prepared spreadsheets, the development would generate enough income within 5 years to provide each of us with annual distributions of over $200,000. Of course, Brianna added with a slight smile, we also have the option for immediate liquidity if you prefer. The $2.8 million purchase offer I mentioned to Cassandra remains on the table. You could walk away today with $800,000 each and let us handle all the development risks. That's when I knew we'd reached the crucial moment. This was the choice point where the scam would either succeed or fail. Cassandra was practically vibrating with excitement, clearly ready to sign whatever documents they placed in front of her. The Apex team was watching both of us carefully, probably trying to gauge whether I was going to be cooperative or problematic. The immediate payment option is interesting, I said slowly. Could I see the purchase contracts before we make a final decision? Absolutely, Jonathan replied, pulling a thick folder from his portfolio. Everything's been prepared by our legal team. The contracts include standard property transfer language, environmental assessments, development easements, and financial guarantees. He handed me a bound document that looked impressively official. The cover page bore the Apex Valley Holdings logo and listed both properties, Grandpa's farm and the mythical Henderson parcel, as included in the transaction. I flipped through the pages, noting the dense legal language and multiple signature lines marked with yellow tabs. On page 12, I found exactly what I'd been looking for, a clause requiring both property owners to transfer full and clear title to all parcels included in the agreement. This looks comprehensive, I said, closing the folder. But I notice it references the Henderson property that Cassandra purchased. Could I see those ownership documents before signing? Brianna's smile flickered for just an instant. Of course. Cassandra, you have the Henderson deed with you, right? Cassandra's confident expression faltered. I thought, didn't your legal team say they'd handle all the title documentation? For the transfer to us, yes, David Shin interjected smoothly. But we need to verify chain of ownership before we can complete the purchase. I watched the three scammers exchange glances so quickly that Cassandra missed it entirely. They'd been counting on her to have forged ownership documents for the Henderson property, but apparently that part of their plan hadn't been completed yet. Actually, I said, setting the contract folder on the farmhouse porch railing, I think there might be some confusion about the Henderson property. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as everyone turned to look at me. I did some research this week, and I couldn't find any record of a Henderson family owning land in Millbrook Valley. In fact, the county courthouse confirmed that no such property exists. Cassandra's face went pale. That's impossible. I have the bank transfer records. I paid for it. You paid someone, I agreed. But not for land in Millbrook Valley. Brianna stepped forward, her professional mask slipping slightly. I think there may be some miscommunication here. The Henderson property is definitely real, though it might be listed under a corporate entity that's not immediately obvious in public records. Which corporate entity? I asked. The silence that followed lasted exactly 7 seconds. I counted. Jonathan Mills cleared his throat. Perhaps we should postpone today's signing until we can resolve any documentation issues. Actually, I said, reaching into my jacket pocket for the small recorder Rebecca had given me, I think we should continue this conversation. Because I have some very specific questions about Apex Valley Holdings, and I think everyone here deserves to hear the answers. That's when Cassandra finally realized that something was terribly wrong. That's when the Apex team understood that their carefully planned con had just turned into something much more dangerous. And that's when I stopped being the accommodating younger sister who cleaned up other people's messes. From this moment forward, I was going to be the person asking the questions that no one wanted to answer. The recorder made a soft clicking sound as I pressed the button, and that tiny noise seemed to echo across the farmyard like a gunshot. Brianna's polished smile disappeared entirely, while Jonathan and David exchanged a look that confirmed everything I needed to know about their true intentions. "What are you doing?" Cassandra asked, her voice rising with confusion and the first hint of panic. "I'm documenting this conversation," I said calmly, holding up the small device. "Because I think everyone here should understand exactly what's been happening over the past few months." Brianna stepped forward, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "I'm afraid we'll need to object to any recording of proprietary business discussions. Our company policies." "Your company doesn't exist," I interrupted, pulling out my phone. "I spent the weekend with a fraud investigator from the Better Business Bureau. Apex Valley Holdings was incorporated 6 months ago using a fake Delaware address. Your website was built 3 weeks after my grandfather died. And every single reference you've provided about previous agricultural preservation projects leads to dead ends." The color drained from Cassandra's face. "Delilah, what are you talking about? We've been planning this for months. I've seen the contracts, the development plans." "You've seen forgeries," I said, turning to face her directly. "Just like the power of attorney documents you used to steal my inheritance money were forgeries. Just like the Henderson property deed you think you purchased. All of it, Cassandra. Every single piece of this opportunity is an elaborate fraud." David Shen had been slowly backing toward the SUV, but he stopped when I mentioned the forged power of attorney. "I think there's been some misunderstanding here. We're legitimate business developers, and if there are documentation issues, our legal team can." "Can what?" I pulled out my leather portfolio and began spreading documents across the porch railing. "Explain why the medical records you helped Cassandra forge show cognitive decline for a man whose own doctor will testify was mentally sharp until the day he died. Explain why you coached her to use specific financial details about our family that she couldn't have known without inside information. Explain why your Henderson property purchase sent my inheritance money to a shell company in the Cayman Islands." That last detail was a bluff, but David's involuntary flinch told me I'd hit close to the mark. Rebecca had warned me that international financial transfers were common in these types of scams, designed to make recovery nearly impossible. Jonathan Mills tried to regain control of the situation. "Look, if there are concerns about documentation, we can postpone today's meeting and have our attorneys review everything. This kind of complexity isn't unusual in large property transactions." "There won't be a postponement," I said, reaching into my pocket for my phone. "Because in about 10 minutes, FBI agent Patricia Lewis will arrive here with a warrant for your arrest on federal wire fraud charges." This was also a bluff. I'd contacted the FBI, but they'd told me investigations of this type could take weeks to develop. But the effect on the 3 scammers was immediate and dramatic. Brianna's professional composure cracked completely, Jonathan actually took a step backward, and David started looking around the property like he was calculating escape routes. Cassandra, meanwhile, had sunk onto the porch steps, staring at the documents I'd spread out. Bank records showing the emptied inheritance account. Copies of the forged power of attorney papers. Communications between the credit union and federal investigators. Timeline notes documenting every lie she'd been told over the past several months. "This isn't possible," she whispered. Brianna showed me other projects. "I've seen photos of developments they've completed. We've had dozens of conversations about the agricultural preservation model. You've seen stock photos and marketing materials from legitimate companies," I explained, my anger finally beginning to show. "These people are professional con artists, Cassandra. They researched our family for months. They knew about Grandpa's financial situation, his farming methods, even details about the equipment loans and property taxes. Someone fed them inside information to make their story believable." Brianna made one last attempt to salvage the situation. "I think emotions are running high here, and there's clearly some miscommunication. Why don't we all take a step back, Anne? Why don't you tell me your real name?" I challenged her. "Because Brianna Hartwell doesn't exist either. The phone number you've been using traces to a voice-over IP service that bounces calls through 4 different states. The hotel where you claim to be staying this week has no record of anyone by that name." The farmyard went completely silent except for the distant sound of wind moving through the wheat fields. For several long seconds, nobody moved or spoke. Then Brianna turned to her two companions and said something that chilled me to the bone. "This is what happens when you don't properly vet the family dynamics. I told you the sister was a risk factor." Jonathan nodded grimly. "Cut and run?" "Cut and run," Brianna confirmed. That's when I realized that despite all my preparation, I'd underestimated how dangerous this situation could become. These weren't just white-collar criminals running a financial scam. They were organized, experienced, and clearly had protocols for when their cons went sideways. David Chen was already walking quickly toward the SUV. "Ladies, it's been a pleasure, but we have other appointments today." "You're not going anywhere," I said, pulling out my phone to call 911. But before I could dial, Jonathan Mills moved faster than I'd expected, reaching for my phone with one hand while grabbing the recorder with the other. "Don't make this more complicated than it needs to be," he said, his voice losing all pretense of professional courtesy. "We tried to do this the easy way." That's when Cassandra finally snapped out of her shock and stood up from the porch steps. For the first time in years, I saw something in her expression that reminded me of the fierce older sister who'd once protected me from playground bullies in elementary school. "Get your hands off my sister," she said, her voice carrying a steel I'd never heard before. Jonathan laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Your sister just cost all of us a lot of money. Maybe you should have explained the situation better." "The situation," Cassandra replied, stepping between Jonathan and me, "is that I may be an idiot who got scammed, but she's still my family. And you're trespassing on our property." Brianna had reached the SUV and was already getting behind the wheel. "Jonathan, we need to go. Now." But Jonathan seemed to be calculating something else entirely. He still had my phone and recorder, and he was looking at the documents spread across the porch railing like he was considering taking those too. "Evidence collection," he muttered, reaching for the bank records. That's when I heard the sound that would later become my favorite memory of this entire ordeal, the rumble of a diesel engine coming up the gravel driveway. But it wasn't the FBI like I'd claimed. It was something better. It was my neighbor Frank Kowalski driving his massive John Deere combine harvester, followed by two pickup trucks carrying his sons Mike and Danny. Frank was 6'4", weighed about 250 pounds, and had been Grandpa's closest friend for 30 years. I'd called him yesterday asking if he could check on the farm this morning, just in case things went badly. The combine harvester rumbled to a stop directly behind the black SUV, effectively blocking it in. Frank climbed down from the cab carrying a tire iron, while Mike and Danny flanked out to either side with what looked suspiciously like hunting rifles. "Morning, Delilah," Frank called out in his gravelly voice. "These folks giving you trouble?" Jonathan Mills looked at the three armed farmers, then at Brianna frantically trying to figure out how to maneuver around the combine harvester, then at David Chen who was now trapped between the vehicles and the farmhouse. He handed me back my phone and recorder without another word. "Smart choice," I said, immediately dialing 911. "Because the real FBI is about to get very interested in your travel plans." As I listened to the phone ring, I looked at Cassandra, who was staring at the scene unfolding around her with a mixture of horror and dawning understanding. "This is real," she said quietly. "This is all real. They really were trying to steal everything." "Yes," I replied, putting my arm around her shoulders as the 911 dispatcher answered. "But they picked the wrong family to mess with." The Millbrook Valley Sheriff's Department arrived 23 minutes after my 911 call, followed closely by two unmarked federal vehicles that I recognized from Rebecca's description of FBI financial crimes investigators. By the time the dust settled, Jonathan Mills, David Chen, and the woman calling herself Brianna Hartwell were sitting in the back of separate patrol cars, while Frank Kowalski and his sons gave statements to a young deputy who looked like he'd never handled anything more serious than a speeding ticket. I spent the next 3 hours answering questions, providing documentation, and watching federal agents methodically photograph every piece of evidence I'd brought. Agent Patricia Lewis, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, took particular interest in the timeline I'd constructed showing how the con had developed over several months. "This level of inside knowledge suggests they had help from someone with access to your family's financial information," she confirmed, reviewing the forged power of attorney documents. We'll be investigating everyone who had contact with your grandfather's estate or your sister in the months leading up to the fraud. Cassandra sat quietly through most of the questioning, answering when spoken to but otherwise staring at her hands like she was seeing them for the first time. The federal agents were professional but firm with her, making it clear that while she might have been a victim of the initial con, her willingness to forge documents and steal from family members put her in legal jeopardy as well. "We'll need you to remain available for further questioning," Agent Lewis told her before the federal team departed. "And you should understand that restitution to your sister is going to be a significant factor in how we proceed with any charges." After the law enforcement convoy finally left, Cassandra and I found ourselves alone on the farmhouse porch for the first time since this whole nightmare began. The October sun was setting, casting long shadows across the wheat fields, and the silence felt heavy with everything that had been said and everything that still needed to be addressed. "How long have you known?" she asked finally. "About the fraud?" "Since the day I found your note in the kitchen." "About you being involved with criminals?" "Since I started researching Apex Valley Holdings last week." She nodded slowly. "I should have known it was too good to be true. The money, the development opportunity, the way they seemed to understand everything about farming and family legacies. It felt like winning the lottery." "When did they first contact you?" Cassandra was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. 3 weeks after Grandpa's funeral. I was really struggling financially. The boutique marketing job I'd been bragging about on social media? I'd been let go 2 months earlier. I was behind on rent, maxed out on credit cards, and too proud to ask for help. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. Then this woman called me out of the blue. Said she represented an agricultural development company that specialized in preserving family farms. She'd read Grandpa's obituary and was interested in discussing opportunities with his heirs. The picture was becoming clearer. Professional con artists who monitored obituaries for wealthy rural families, then targeted the most financially vulnerable family members with promises of easy money. She knew things, Delilah. Details about Grandpa's farming methods, the equipment he used, even stories about our family history that I'd forgotten. She made me feel like I was important, like I had valuable knowledge about agricultural heritage that could help preserve other family farms. What was her name? Patricia Chen. She said she was David's sister, that their family had lost their own farm to developers and now they were dedicated to helping other families avoid the same fate. Cassandra laughed bitterly. I bought every word of it. She was so passionate, so knowledgeable. And she listened to me talk about feeling shut out of Grandpa's life, about watching you become his favorite while I felt invisible. That hurt more than I'd expected. Cassandra, you weren't shut out. You chose not to be involved. Every time Grandpa invited you to visit, you had something else going on. I know that now. But at the time, when Patricia called, it felt like validation. Like someone finally understood that I deserved to be part of the family legacy too. She looked at me directly for the first time since the arrests. She spent weeks building up my confidence, teaching me about agricultural development, showing me how to research property values and zoning regulations. I thought I was becoming a real businesswoman. When did they ask you to access the inheritance money? It was gradual. First, Patricia just wanted to understand the family's financial situation so they could structure a proper development proposal. Then she suggested that time was running out on the Henderson opportunity, that we needed to move quickly or lose it forever. She even had me talk to a fake real estate agent who confirmed that the Henderson family was desperate to sell. The methodical nature of the manipulation was staggering. They'd spent months grooming Cassandra, building her confidence while isolating her from anyone who might question their story. The power of attorney documents, how did you get those? Cassandra's face flushed with shame. Patricia's legal team prepared them. They told me it was standard procedure for estate transactions, that families often needed to streamline decision-making to take advantage of time-sensitive opportunities. They even provided examples of other families who'd used similar arrangements successfully. And you never thought to verify any of this with Harold Westfield or an independent lawyer? They warned me against that. Said local lawyers in small towns often don't understand complex agricultural development deals, and that involving them would just create delays and unnecessary legal fees. She shook her head in disgust. God, I was so stupid. They had an answer for every concern, a reason why their way was better than the traditional approach. I wanted to be angry with her, and part of me still was. But I was also beginning to understand how sophisticated this operation had been. They hadn't just stolen money, they'd conducted a months-long psychological manipulation designed to turn my sister into an unwitting accomplice. What happened to the $180,000? According to Patricia, it was being held in an escrow account pending completion of the Henderson property transfer. She showed me bank statements, transaction records, everything looked legitimate. Cassandra's voice cracked. Last week, when she told me about the Apex Valley Holdings opportunity, she said the Henderson money would be rolled into the larger development deal. I thought I was being smart, maximizing our investment potential. Do you have any idea where the money actually went? The FBI agents asked me the same thing. All I have are the fake documents Patricia gave me. But Agent Lewis said they've tracked similar scams to offshore accounts that are nearly impossible to recover from. The full scope of what had been stolen was starting to sink in. Not just my inheritance money, but potentially Grandpa's entire legacy. If the scammers had succeeded in getting signatures on the property transfer documents today, they might have stolen the farm itself. Cassandra, you understand that you're going to be facing criminal charges for this? She nodded miserably. Agent Lewis made that very clear. Wire fraud, elder abuse fraud, identity theft for the forged power of attorney. She said I'm looking at federal prison time unless I cooperate fully with their investigation and make full restitution. Can you make restitution? Do you have $180,000? I have about $800 in my checking account and a car that's worth maybe $12,000 if I'm lucky. Everything else I own could fit in 2 suitcases. She looked out across the wheat fields, her voice hollow. I destroyed my own life and yours for the promise of money that never existed. As the sun finished setting, I made a decision that surprised both of us. We're going to get through this, I said. But things are going to be different from now on. No more lies, no more schemes, no more expecting me to clean up your messes. If you want to rebuild any kind of relationship with me, you're going to have to prove that you've learned from this. Cassandra looked at me with something that might have been hope. What does that mean? It means you're going to cooperate completely with the FBI investigation. You're going to testify against those people who manipulated you. And you're going to figure out how to pay me back every penny they stole, even if it takes you the rest of your life. And if I do all that? I stood up from the porch steps and looked at the farmhouse that represented everything Grandpa had built, everything he'd trusted me to protect. Then maybe we can start over. But first, we're going to make sure those people never get the chance to do this to another family. Because while the immediate crisis was over, I was beginning to realize that this wasn't just about recovering stolen money. It was about dismantling an entire criminal operation, and my sister was going to help me do it. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Word had spread through Millbrook Valley faster than a prairie fire: FBI arrests at the old Ezra farm, federal investigators asking questions about inheritance fraud, and rumors that the quiet Matthews girl had somehow brought down an entire criminal operation. Most of the messages were from neighbors and family friends expressing shock and offering support. But 3 of them made my blood run cold. They were from relatives I barely knew, people from Grandpa's extended family who lived in other states and only contacted us for weddings and funerals. The first was from my great-aunt Helen in Nebraska. Delilah, honey, I hope you're okay. A woman called yesterday asking questions about your grandfather's will and your family's financial situation. Said she was from an estate planning company helping families protect inheritance assets. Seemed to know a lot about your situation. I didn't tell her anything, but she had your phone number and address. The second was from my cousin Robert in Kansas. Strange call yesterday. Someone claiming to represent a legal advocacy group for families affected by inheritance fraud. Wanted to know if we thought you might have manipulated Grandpa when he was dying. I hung up on them, but they called back twice. The third message was the most disturbing. It was from my Uncle Pete, Grandpa's younger brother, who lived in Montana and ran a small cattle ranch. Delilah, I got a very concerning phone call this morning. Someone claiming to be from the FBI said you were under investigation for elder abuse and financial exploitation of your grandfather. They wanted to know about family dynamics and whether I thought the will was legitimate. Something felt off about the whole conversation, so I asked for their badge number and agency contact information. They hung up immediately. I called Rebecca Stone before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. They're running a damage control operation, she said after I'd read her the messages. Professional con artists don't just disappear when they get arrested. They have networks, backup plans, ways to discredit victims who threaten their other operations. But the 3 people from yesterday are in federal custody. 3 people that we know about. But Agent Lewis told you this looked like an organized operation with inside information sources. There could be other team members, other scams running simultaneously, even handlers who coordinate multiple con games. Rebecca's voice was tense. They're trying to destroy your credibility before you can testify against them. The strategy was becoming clear. If they could convince extended family members that I'd manipulated Grandpa's will or exploited him financially, they could undermine any testimony I might give about the fraud. They might even be laying groundwork for a defense claiming that I was the real criminal and that Cassandra had been trying to protect family assets from my influence. What should I do about the family members who were contacted? Document everything. Get written statements from anyone who received suspicious calls. We'll turn it all over to the FBI as evidence of witness intimidation. Rebecca paused. And Delilah? Be very careful about who you trust right now. If these people had inside information about your grandfather's finances, someone close to your family might still be feeding them information. That afternoon, I drove to Cassandra's apartment for the first time in over 2 years. She'd been staying there since the arrests yesterday, and Agent Lewis had instructed her not to leave town while the investigation continued. The building was one of those generic complexes that catered to young professionals who couldn't quite afford houses yet, all beige siding and small windows that never let in enough light. Cassandra answered the door in wrinkled pajamas, looking like she hadn't slept since our conversation on the farmhouse porch. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her eyes were red-rimmed from crying. They're calling my family, she said without preamble. Mom's cousins in Ohio, Aunt Rachel in Texas, even great-uncle Jim who I haven't spoken to in 10 years. Someone's spreading stories about both of us, saying we conspired to steal Grandpa's estate. I followed her into the small living room, noting the stack of legal documents on the coffee table and the laptop open to what looked like financial records. What exactly are they saying? That we worked together to manipulate Grandpa when he was dying. That the will was forged or coerced. That the inheritance fraud story is just a cover for our own theft. Cassandra sank onto the couch, looking defeated. Uncle Jim called me directly this morning. He said someone claiming to be a federal investigator told him that I'd been stealing from Grandpa for years and that you'd helped cover it up. The sophistication of the operation was staggering. Not only were they trying to discredit us individually, but they were creating a narrative that made us co-conspirators rather than victim and victim-turned-accomplice. Did Uncle Jim believe them? He wasn't sure what to believe. But he said the person he talked to knew details about our family that outsiders shouldn't know. Grandpa's medical history, financial habits, even stories about our childhood that I'd forgotten. Cassandra looked at me with growing alarm. Delilah, how could strangers know that much about our family? I'd been asking myself the same question since Agent Lewis mentioned inside information sources. The list of people with access to detailed family history and financial information was short: immediate family, Grandpa's doctor, his lawyer, the bank employees who'd handled his accounts, maybe a few close neighbors. Have you talked to anyone about our family situation in the past year? Friends, co-workers, anyone who might have seemed unusually interested? Cassandra was quiet for a long moment, thinking. There was. Patricia asked a lot of questions about family dynamics when she first contacted me. But I thought she was just trying to understand how to structure the development deal appropriately. What kind of questions? About who made financial decisions for Grandpa as he got older. About your relationship with him versus mine. About whether there had been any family disputes over his care or his assets. Cassandra's face went pale as she remembered. She even asked about his medical conditions and whether he'd been showing signs of confusion or memory problems. You gave her information that she later used to create the forged medical records. Oh God. Cassandra buried her face in her hands. I didn't just steal your inheritance. I gave them the ammunition they needed to attack Grandpa's entire legacy. But there was something else bothering me, a piece that didn't fit the pattern of information gathering through manipulation of family members. Cassandra, think carefully. The details they're sharing with extended family now, are they things you told Patricia, or are they things you never discussed with anyone outside the immediate family? She looked up, confused. What do you mean? Uncle Jim said they knew stories about our childhood. But you and I haven't shared childhood memories with outsiders in years, and Grandpa certainly wouldn't have discussed them with strangers. So where did that information come from? Cassandra's eyes widened as the implication hit her. You think someone in our immediate family is involved? I think someone with access to family stories, financial records, and knowledge about Grandpa's medical care fed information to these con artists. And that same person is probably still feeding them information about our current situation. The room went silent except for the hum of traffic outside and the distant sound of a neighbor's television. We were both thinking the same thing, but neither of us wanted to say it out loud. There's only one person who fits that description, Cassandra said finally. Mom. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my recent calls. She contacted me 3 times yesterday after news of the arrest started spreading. Left voicemails saying she was worried about me, wanted to make sure I was okay, asked if I needed help dealing with the legal situation. She called me too. Wanted to know exactly what had happened, what I'd told the FBI, whether they'd indicated how the investigation might proceed. Cassandra's voice was getting stronger as the pieces clicked into place. I thought she was just being protective. But she asked very specific questions about financial details and legal procedures. Questions that someone might ask if they were reporting back to people who needed to know how much damage control was required. I thought about the months leading up to Grandpa's death, the way Mom had occasionally visited him when I wasn't there, the access she'd had to his financial information and medical records. I thought about her reaction to the will reading, the tight-lipped disappointment when she realized she'd been excluded entirely. She's been planning this longer than any of us realized, I said. The con artists didn't just target you randomly. They had inside help from someone who knew our family's vulnerabilities and could provide ongoing intelligence about our responses. Cassandra stood up and began pacing the small living room. So what do we do? If Mom's involved, if she's been feeding them information this whole time, then she knows about our conversation with the FBI yesterday. She knows what evidence we have and what we're planning to do. I was already reaching for my phone to call Agent Lewis when Cassandra grabbed my wrist. Wait. If we're right about this, if Mom is working with them, then she's going to know the moment we contact the FBI about her involvement. And if she warns them, they'll disappear completely, I finished. Along with any chance of recovering the stolen money or preventing them from targeting other families. So we need proof before we can report our suspicions. I looked at my sister, seeing something in her expression I hadn't seen since we were children, determination mixed with genuine remorse and a desire to make things right. Are you willing to help me get that proof? Even if it means confronting Mom directly? After everything I've done, after all the damage I've caused? Cassandra met my eyes steadily. Yes. It's time I started cleaning up my own messes instead of creating new ones for you to handle. Then we're going to set a trap. And this time, we're going to catch everyone involved in destroying our family. The plan we developed was simple in concept but risky in execution. We would feed our mother false information designed to flush out her connection to the con artists, then document any suspicious activity that followed. Rebecca Stone had initially objected to civilians conducting their own counterintelligence operation, but Agent Lewis surprised us both by approving a modified version under FBI supervision. If your mother is actively obstructing a federal investigation by providing intelligence to criminal suspects, we need evidence that will hold up in court, Agent Lewis explained during our Tuesday morning meeting at the federal building in the county seat. Recorded conversations, documented information transfers, proof of coordination with known fraudsters. What you're proposing could provide exactly that kind of evidence. The setup required careful choreography. Cassandra would call our mother Wednesday evening with fake news that I discovered additional hidden assets from Grandpa's estate, a safety deposit box containing bearer bonds worth approximately $400,000 that had been missed during the initial probate process. She would claim that I planned to keep this discovery secret from investigators to avoid complications with the fraud case. The key is making it believable but also immediately actionable, Agent Lewis instructed. Criminal networks respond quickly to intelligence about new financial opportunities, especially when their current operations are under law enforcement pressure. I spent Tuesday night rehearsing my part of the performance with a female FBI agent who would be monitoring all communications. If Mom contacted me seeking confirmation of Cassandra's story, I needed to provide just enough detail to seem credible while avoiding any actual commitment to illegal activity. Wednesday morning brought the first test of our theory. Mom called me at 7:15 a.m., ostensibly to check on my emotional state after the weekend's arrests. "I can't stop thinking about how traumatic this must have been for you," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of maternal concern that had always made me feel guilty for not sharing more personal information. Having your own sister involved in something so terrible, and then finding out you'd been targeted by professional criminals. You must be feeling so confused and betrayed. "I'm managing," I replied carefully, noting that Agent Lewis had been right about the fishing expedition nature of the call. "The FBI has been very supportive, and I'm confident they'll recover most of the stolen money." "Oh, that's wonderful news. I was so worried that you might lose everything Grandpa worked for." A pause. "Are they close to wrapping up the investigation?" "They haven't given me a specific timeline, but Agent Lewis mentioned that financial crimes cases often take months to fully resolve, especially when they involve multiple jurisdictions and complex money transfers." This was partially true. Agent Lewis had mentioned the complexity issue, but I was also testing whether Mom would relay timeline information to outside parties. "Well, at least you still have the farm and the house. That's the most important thing, preserving what Grandpa built." "Actually, that's been more complicated than expected. Apparently there are some probate issues that weren't fully resolved when the estate was settled. Harold Westfield is reviewing everything to make sure there aren't any other surprises." Another test. Harold Westfield wasn't reviewing anything, but if Mom reported this conversation to co-conspirators, they might attempt to contact Grandpa's lawyer seeking information about additional estate assets. "What kind of probate issues?" Mom's voice had sharpened slightly. "I probably shouldn't discuss the details while the investigation is ongoing. You understand." Of course. I just worry about you dealing with all this complexity on your own." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Mom asking increasingly specific questions about my interactions with federal investigators, my emotional state, and my future plans for the farm. By the time we hung up, I was convinced that someone had coached her on what information to gather. Wednesday afternoon brought confirmation. Harold Westfield called to report that his office had received an inquiry from someone claiming to represent an estate audit firm, asking about additional assets that might have been overlooked during Grandpa's probate process. "The caller knew details about your grandfather's will that aren't public record," Harold reported. "They specifically asked about safety deposit boxes, investment accounts, and any property transfers that might have been processed outside normal channels." "Did you give them any information?" "Absolutely not. But the fact that they called within 6 hours of your conversation with your mother is concerning." That evening, Cassandra made her performance call to Mom, describing her fake discovery of the bearer bonds in dramatic detail. "According to our script, I'd found an old safety deposit box key hidden in Grandpa's workshop and had accessed the box without informing authorities, discovering negotiable securities that predated digital banking records. She's planning to cash them quietly and use the money to hire private investigators to track down the stolen inheritance funds," Cassandra told Mom, her voice carrying just the right mix of excitement and concern. "She thinks the FBI isn't moving fast enough, and she wants to take matters into her own hands." "That sounds very risky," Mom replied. "Securities like that often have complex legal issues. She should probably consult with a financial advisor before making any hasty decisions." I tried to tell her that, but you know how stubborn Delilah gets when she's made up her mind about something. She said she's going to the bank tomorrow morning to have them appraised and possibly converted to cash. We listened to the recorded conversation afterward, noting how quickly Mom had shifted from cautionary advice to probing questions about which bank I planned to use, what time I planned to arrive, and whether I'd be bringing any security with me. Thursday morning at 9:30 a.m., I walked into First National Bank of Millbrook Valley carrying a small metal box that contained nothing but old receipts and expired warranties. Agent Lewis and 2 other federal investigators were positioned in unmarked vehicles with clear sight lines to the bank entrance, while Cassandra monitored communications from a surveillance van parked at the grocery store across the street. I spent exactly 45 minutes inside the bank, meeting with a loan officer about refinancing options for farm equipment purchases. It was a legitimate conversation that provided cover for my presence while serving no purpose related to any fictional bearer bonds. But the real operation was happening outside. Federal agents documented 3 separate vehicles that followed me to the bank, remained in the area during my visit, and then trailed me when I left. License plate checks revealed that 2 of the vehicles were rental cars paid for with credit cards linked to shell companies, while the third belonged to someone with multiple aliases and an extensive criminal history involving financial fraud. More significantly, electronic surveillance detected multiple phone calls between watchers and unknown parties, discussing my activities, timing, and apparent security arrangements. The language was professional, coordinated, and clearly indicated that my fictional financial discovery had triggered an immediate operational response. Your mother made 8 phone calls between last night and this morning, Agent Lewis reported during our debriefing Thursday afternoon. 3 to numbers we've traced to burner phones, 2 to confirmed associates of the arrested fraud suspects, and 3 to unknown parties using encrypted communication services. The pattern was clear. Mom wasn't just providing information to the con artists, she was actively coordinating ongoing criminal operations against her own daughters. What's our next step? Cassandra asked. Tomorrow morning, we arrest your mother on federal conspiracy charges, Agent Lewis replied. And then we use her communications network to roll up the rest of this criminal organization. But even as I felt satisfaction at the prospect of justice being served, I couldn't shake the deeper horror of what we discovered. My mother hadn't just enabled strangers to steal from her own family. She'd been an active participant in a conspiracy designed to strip us of everything Grandpa had worked to build. There's one thing I don't understand, I said. Why would she help them target Cassandra and me? What did she think she was going to gain from this? Agent Lewis exchanged glances with her colleague before answering. Based on the communications we've intercepted, your mother was promised a significant percentage of any funds recovered through the agricultural development scam. She wasn't just providing intelligence, she was expecting to be paid for her cooperation. The betrayal was complete. Mom hadn't been manipulated or coerced into helping criminals target her own daughters. She'd sold us out for money, then sat back and watched as our lives were systematically destroyed by people she'd helped recruit and coordinate. Tomorrow, she would learn that her criminal partnership had been a mistake that would cost her everything. But tonight, I just wanted to go home to the farm and sit in Grandpa's chair and remember what it felt like to be part of a family that actually cared about protecting each other instead of exploiting each other. That time felt very far away. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Millbrook Valley look like a postcard, all golden wheat fields and red barns against a brilliant blue sky. I was drinking coffee on the farmhouse porch when Agent Lewis called to confirm that the operation was proceeding as planned. Your mother's arrest is scheduled for 8:30 a.m. at her residence, she reported. Simultaneously, we're executing search warrants on 3 properties linked to the fraud network, including 2 storage units where we believe they've been keeping documents and equipment used to create forged financial instruments. I checked my watch. 8:15 a.m. In 15 minutes, the woman who'd given birth to me, raised me, and then systematically betrayed everything our family stood for would be taken into federal custody. How do you feel? Cassandra asked, joining me on the porch with her own coffee. She'd spent the night at the farm, sleeping in her old childhood bedroom for the first time in over 5 years. Empty, I said honestly. I thought I'd feel angry or vindicated or something. But mostly I just feel empty. The phone rang at exactly 8:47 a.m. Agent Lewis again. We have a problem. Your mother isn't at her apartment. According to the building manager, she left yesterday evening with 2 large suitcases and hasn't returned. Her car is gone, her cell phone is going straight to voicemail, and the apartment appears to have been hastily cleared of personal documents. My stomach dropped. She ran. It appears so. We're issuing an APB and notifying airport security, but she had at least 12 hours head start. Agent Lewis paused. There's something else. We executed the storage unit searches, and we found extensive documentation of other fraud operations targeting inheritance recipients across the Midwest. Your family wasn't their only target. It looks like they've been running similar cons for at least 2 years. The scope was staggering. Professional criminals with an organized infrastructure specifically designed to target families grieving the loss of elderly relatives. Mom hadn't just betrayed us, she'd been part of a network that systematically exploited people at their most vulnerable moments. What about the other arrested suspects? Are they still in custody? That's where it gets interesting. Jonathan Mills, the man who called himself the project manager, started talking yesterday afternoon when he realized your mother had disappeared. Apparently, he and his associates were as much victims of this operation as you were. I blinked in confusion. What do you mean? According to Mills, they were hired as actors to play the roles of development executives for what they thought was an elaborate corporate training exercise. They were told it was a simulation designed to test corporate security protocols and employee awareness of financial fraud schemes. The revelation was mind-bending. They weren't actually criminals. Mills is a struggling actor from Los Angeles. Chen is a recent business school graduate who needed money for student loans. The woman calling herself Brianna Hartwell is actually Margaret Torres, a former real estate agent who lost her license due to unrelated ethical violations. Agent Lewis's voice carried a note of professional admiration for the con's complexity. They were recruited through legitimate talent agencies and temporary employment services, given detailed scripts and background materials, and paid substantial day rates for what they believed was corporate consulting work. But they were so convincing. They knew details about farming, about agricultural development, about local zoning laws. Because they'd been provided with extensive training materials and coaching. The real criminals running this operation created a complete fictional business infrastructure, down to fake websites, forged client references, and detailed industry knowledge. The actors thought they were helping test corporate vulnerabilities, not participating in actual fraud. Cassandra had been listening to my side of the conversation with growing amazement. So the people we met at the farm weren't actually the ones who stole the money? Correct. Mills, Chen, and Torres will likely face charges for their participation, but they're also victims of elaborate employment fraud. They were paid for their acting services with checks that came from the stolen inheritance funds, making them unwitting recipients of the proceeds of your mother's crimes. The true masterminds, Agent Lewis explained, had remained completely invisible throughout the operation. Mom had been their only direct contact with our family, providing intelligence and coordinating the actors' performances without revealing the identities of the people actually controlling the scheme. So where does this leave the investigation? We're following the financial trail. The checks paid to the actors came from accounts that can be traced back through multiple shell companies and overseas transfers. It's complex, but we have forensic accountants working on it. Agent Lewis paused. However, I need to be honest with you about the likelihood of asset recovery. These people are professionals who've clearly done this before. They've probably moved the stolen funds through multiple jurisdictions and conversion mechanisms designed to make recovery nearly impossible. The practical implications were sinking in. Even if law enforcement eventually identified and arrested the real criminals, the $180,000 they'd stolen from my inheritance was likely gone forever. Grandpa's life savings, the financial security he'd worked decades to build, had vanished into a network of international financial instruments that might be impossible to trace or recover. What about Mom? If she's fled, what are the chances of finding her? That depends on how much help she's receiving from her criminal associates. If they provided her with false identity documents, offshore banking access, or international travel arrangements, she could stay hidden indefinitely. Agent Lewis's tone became more sympathetic. I'm sorry, Delilah. I know this isn't the resolution you were hoping for. After hanging up, Cassandra and I sat in silence for several minutes, watching the morning sunlight move across the wheat fields. Everything we'd fought for over the past 2 weeks, justice, accountability, the recovery of stolen funds, seemed to be slipping away just when victory had appeared within reach. I'm still going to pay you back, Cassandra said finally. Every penny. Even if it takes me 20 years. How? You don't have a job, your credit is destroyed, and you're facing federal charges. I'll figure something out. I'll work 3 jobs if I have to. I'll live in a studio apartment and eat ramen noodles for the next decade. She turned to look at me directly. I'm not going to let this be how our story ends. I'm not going to be like Mom, running away when things get difficult. Over the next several hours, we received updates on the expanding investigation. FBI teams in 4 states were executing search warrants and making arrests based on evidence found in the storage units. The fraud network had targeted dozens of families, stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars through variations of the agricultural development scam that had ensnared us. Most significantly, investigators had discovered communications suggesting that Mom's role had evolved far beyond providing intelligence about our specific family. She'd apparently been recruiting other potential inside sources, using social media and genealogy websites to identify families with elderly relatives who own valuable property in rural areas. She turned this into her career, Rebecca Stone observed during a late afternoon call. Your mother wasn't just an opportunistic accomplice. She'd become a professional scout for inheritance fraud schemes. The betrayal felt complete and irreversible. But as the day progressed, I began to realize that our victory might be different than what I'd originally hoped for, but it was still real and meaningful. We'd stopped the immediate threat to our family's legacy. We'd provided evidence that would help law enforcement dismantle a network that had victimized multiple families. We'd prevented future crimes by exposing the methods and infrastructure used to target inheritance recipients. Most importantly, we'd forced ourselves to confront the truth about our family dynamics and make fundamental changes in how we related to each other. That evening, as the sun set over Millbrook Valley, Cassandra and I walked the perimeter of Grandpa's property, checking fence lines and planning improvements for the coming season. The land felt solid under our feet, permanent and valuable in ways that had nothing to do with money. You know what the ironic thing is? Cassandra said as we completed the circuit back to the farmhouse. If Mom had just been honest about her financial problems, if she'd asked for help instead of trying to steal everything, you probably would have shared the inheritance with her anyway. She was right. If Mom had approached me directly, explained her situation, and asked for assistance, I would have found ways to help her without compromising Grandpa's legacy or putting the farm at risk. Instead, she'd chosen betrayal, criminality, and ultimately exile from the family she'd tried so hard to exploit. Her choice, I said simply. Now we deal with the consequences and move forward. Moving forward meant rebuilding, both practically and emotionally. The stolen money might never be recovered, but the farm remained intact, and we had each other in ways that hadn't been true for years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and the continued process of healing from everything that had happened. But tonight, we were finally home. 2 years later, I stood in the same spot on the farmhouse porch where this nightmare had begun, but everything had changed. The October morning was crisp and golden, just like that day when I'd first discovered Cassandra's note about the stolen inheritance. But instead of anger and betrayal, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. The farm was thriving in ways Grandpa never could have imagined. Cassandra had moved into the small apartment above the old equipment barn 18 months ago, and together we transformed the property into exactly the kind of sustainable agricultural operation the con artists had pretended to offer. We'd started small, a farm stand selling heirloom vegetables and fresh eggs, weekend tours for families wanting to show their children where food actually comes from, and a small bed and breakfast operation using 3 of the farmhouse's upstairs bedrooms. The Johnson wedding party will be here at noon for their rehearsal dinner setup, Cassandra called from the kitchen, where she was preparing her signature farm-to-table menu. And the agricultural extension class arrives at 2 for the sustainable farming workshop. My sister had discovered something remarkable in the wreckage of her old life. She actually had a talent for hospitality and event planning. The business skills she'd thought she was learning from the con artists turned out to be real, just misdirected. When applied to legitimate purposes, her enthusiasm and attention to detail had transformed our struggling family farm into a profitable enterprise that honored Grandpa's legacy while building something entirely new. The financial recovery had been slow but steady. The FBI had eventually recovered about $60,000 of the stolen inheritance money through asset forfeiture from the criminal network's domestic accounts. Cassandra had established a formal repayment plan for the remaining $120,000, contributing every penny of profit from her portion of the business operations toward her debt to me. More importantly, she'd kept her promise about cooperation with law enforcement. Her testimony had been instrumental in convicting the leaders of the inheritance fraud network, including 2 men who'd never set foot in Millbrook Valley but had orchestrated dozens of similar schemes across the Midwest. The investigation had also led to the recovery of hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen from other families, though many victims would never see their money again. Mom remained a fugitive. The FBI had tracked her as far as Mexico City before the trail went cold, and Agent Lewis suspected she'd received sophisticated help in establishing a new identity. Cassandra and I had both struggled with the reality that our mother had chosen permanent exile rather than face the consequences of her betrayal. But over time, we'd made peace with her absence. Some relationships couldn't be rebuilt, and some trust could never be restored. I think about her sometimes, Cassandra admitted during one of our evening conversations last summer. Wonder if she's safe, if she regrets what she did, if she ever thinks about what she lost. I think about her too, I'd replied. But I've learned that you can't save people who don't want to be saved. Mom made her choice. Now we make ours. Our choice had been to build something beautiful from the destruction she'd left behind. The legal aftermath had been complex but ultimately manageable. Cassandra had pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud charges and received 3 years of supervised probation, 400 hours of community service, and a requirement to make full restitution. Her cooperation with the investigation and the clear evidence of her own victimization had convinced the prosecutors to recommend the minimum sentence allowable under federal guidelines. She'd thrown herself into the community service requirement, volunteering with a financial literacy program that educated elderly people about common fraud schemes. Her first-hand experience as both perpetrator and victim gave her a unique perspective that resonated with audiences who might have dismissed warnings from law enforcement or social workers. The thing I tell people, she would say during her presentations, is that criminals don't look like criminals. They look like opportunities. They study you, they understand your vulnerabilities, and they tell you exactly what you want to hear. I thought I was being smart and proactive. I thought I was protecting my family's legacy. Instead, I almost destroyed everything my grandfather had worked for. The farm itself had become something Grandpa would have been proud of, though probably surprised by. We'd kept the traditional wheat production but added diversified crops, a small dairy operation with heritage breed goats, and an apiary that produced some of the best honey in the county. The old barn now hosted wedding receptions and corporate retreats, while the equipment shed had been converted into a workshop space where we taught traditional farming skills to urban families. Most importantly, we'd established the Ezra Matthews Agricultural Preservation Trust, a legal entity that ensured the farm would remain in agricultural use in perpetuity. No future family disputes or financial crises could force the sale of the land to developers. Grandpa's vision of keeping Millbrook Valley in farming families was now legally protected for generations. You know what I realized? Cassandra said that October morning as we watched the sunrise paint the wheat fields gold. We actually ended up creating what those con artists pretended to offer. Educational tourism, agricultural preservation, sustainable farming practices, honoring family legacy while building something new. She was right. In fighting to save Grandpa's legacy, we'd accidentally fulfilled the vision that had made their scam so appealing in the first place. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The difference is that we did it honestly, I replied. We didn't steal from anyone, we didn't lie to anyone, and we didn't sacrifice our family relationships for money. The success of our legitimate operation had attracted attention from agricultural colleges and sustainable farming organizations. We'd been featured in several farming magazines and had recently been approached by a documentary filmmaker interested in our story of recovery and renewal after financial fraud. It's funny, Cassandra mused. I spent most of my adult life trying to find some get-rich-quick scheme that would solve all my problems. Turns out the answer was just working hard at something meaningful with people I cared about. That afternoon, I received a call from Agent Lewis with news that brought our story full circle. "We've identified the mastermind behind the inheritance fraud network," she reported. "A woman named Patricia Chen, operating out of Vancouver. She's been arrested by Canadian authorities and will be extradited to face federal charges here." Patricia Chen. The same name Cassandra had given me 2 years ago as her initial contact from the fake agricultural development company. "How did you find her?" "Financial forensics, combined with testimony from other victims. Turns out she's been running inheritance scams for over 5 years, targeting rural families across North America. Your case provided crucial evidence linking her to operations in multiple countries. The arrest meant that the person most directly responsible for destroying our family would finally face justice. But more importantly, it meant that dozens of other families would be protected from the kind of systematic exploitation we'd experienced." That evening, Cassandra and I sat on the same porch where Grandpa used to tell us stories about knowing your people and judging them by their actions rather than their words. The wheat field stretched out before us in the fading light, representing not just our family's past but our shared future. "I've been thinking about forgiveness lately," Cassandra said quietly. "Not for Mom, necessarily, but for myself. For the person I used to be, the choices I made, the way I treated family like something to be exploited rather than treasured." "You're not that person anymore." "No, but I was for a long time. And I need to make peace with that before I can fully move forward." I understood what she meant. The journey from victim to survivor to someone who'd built something meaningful from the wreckage had required both of us to confront uncomfortable truths about who we'd been and who we wanted to become. "Grandpa used to say that the land teaches patience," I said. "You plant seeds, you tend them carefully, you wait for the right season, and eventually you harvest something valuable. But it takes time, and it requires you to think beyond immediate gratification." "I'm learning," Cassandra replied. "Slowly, but I'm learning." As the stars appeared over Millbrook Valley, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from protecting something precious while building something new. The quiet girl who'd once been everyone's backup plan had become someone who refused to be anyone's victim. The sister who'd once stolen from family had become a partner in preserving our shared legacy. We'd lost money that would never be recovered and family relationships that could never be repaired. But we'd gained something more valuable, the knowledge that we could face any crisis together and emerge stronger on the other side. The farm would endure. The legacy would continue. And for the first time in years, we were exactly where we belonged. Home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.